2, 1, go. Okay, it seems to be working.
Okay, so then I just start, or
Yeah.
how do you know? Okay.
Oh, well, wait, do we want to give like a quick introduction? Someone want to provide an introduction?
Yeah, I'll do it. So today we're gonna have Lioba Heimbach. Oh.
Okay, so then I just start, or
Okay, we have a echo. Sorry.
Okay, cool. So I'll just introduce our speaker today. We have Lioba Heimbach from ETH Zurich. And I think her work focuses on like PBS and like arbitrage and MEV. So she can take it away now. Cool.
yes. So thanks for the intro. So yeah, basically this is a talk about PBS and non-atomic arbitrage, and it's largely sort of or entirely based on two papers. So one of them is Ethereum's proposer-builder separation, which sort of is an early measurement study of the proposer-builder separation scheme, or PBS for short. And the second one is a study of non-atomic arbitrage in DeFi, which is sort of a type of MEV, which is also commonly referred to as sec-stacks arbitrage. And these sort of transactions that are performing this type of arbitrage, they sort of largely pass through the PBS scheme, and they themselves then again sort of feedback or impact the PBS scheme. And yeah, maybe just to mention, thanks for having me. And sort of if you have any questions at any point, feel free to just sort of unmute yourself and interrupt me. Okay, so I'm going to start first with the sort of PBS part of our work. And I mean, as you might be familiar with, or yeah, the vast majority of blocks sort of these days in Ethereum, they're being built through PBS. And so I'm going to start sort of with a brief overview on the screen. So basically what PBS does is that the blocks are no longer built by sort of the proposer or validator, but instead sort of specialized builders are tasked with actually building the blocks. And on the slide, you can sort of see a general overview of the scheme with sort of its four players, which is searchers, builders, relays, and the proposers. I mean, for each of them, I'm only drawing one, but you would expect multiple, and then only one proposer for each given slot. And basically, sort of, let's look at the flow of transactions and the way blocks are being built through this scheme. So basically, in the first step, we have a searcher here. And the searcher basically sort of collects bundles of or just transactions on their own. And it does so sort of by potentially putting its own in, some private ones or some from the public mempool. So in the example, you can sort of see on the slide here now, we have Alice, and she wants to exchange Bitcoin for Ether on Uniswap. And basically, she then broadcasts this transaction through the public mempool, and the searcher then can see her transaction and include it in their bundle. This transaction sort of might be especially attractive for a searcher because it could be possible that it's sort of profitable to perform a sandwich attack on it, so to front run the transaction for profit. And if so, the builder sort of then prepares its own sort of transactions that perform the sandwich attack on Alice and bundles them all together. And potentially sort of with some other transactions as well, but then sends this bundle to the builder. Here again, it could potentially send it to multiple builders. And the builder then sort of receives this transaction along with sort of other bundles from other searchers, and can also sort of look for transactions on its own in the mempool or its own private order flow. So for instance, here we then have another transaction where Charlotte just sends some ETH to Dave. And basically then the builder sort of takes these bundles of transactions as well as sort of the other transaction it gets and puts them into a high value block. So basically a block where there's a lot of sort of fees being paid, either through priority fees or sort of through Coinbase transfers, so direct transfers to the block's fee recipient. And basically, then it also attaches a bid to this block. So the bid is just the amount that the builder would pay the proposer to have this block then included on chain. And then this builder sends the block to the relay, and a relay here potentially receives many other blocks from the same builder with sort of increasing bids or sort of from other builders as well. But what happens then is that eventually sort of the proposer that is chosen for the block might ask the relay to send it a block, so request the block. So what the relay then does, it will prepare a blinded block, sort of for the highest value block that it currently has. And sort of the value here is the bid, so how much the proposer would receive for proposing this block then to the network. And maybe one thing to note is sort of that the relay is being trusted in this system. So the relay is also responsible for making sure sort of that everything is good with the block and that the bid is correct, so that the proposer would actually receive this value. And then it sends this blinded block along with the bid to the proposer, who might receive multiple blocks. And then the proposer sort of chooses a block. We would expect it to just choose the highest value block, signs the block, and sends the signature back to the relay, who can then take the signature, sort of attach it to the full blocks, so the unblinded version, and then our block is ready to be released through the network. So this is sort of just the general overview of how PBS works. And PBS was sort of introduced along with Ethereum proof of stake. And basically sort of it separates this role of actually proposing the block and building the block. And basically there were sort of two goals which are repeatedly stated as being sort of the main drivers or incentives of PBS, where the first one is sort of to prevent hobbyist validators from being outcompeted by institutional players. And sort of the idea here is that sort of these institutional players, if you're running multiple validators, you can invest sort of in infrastructure to build these high value block with. This is not possible sort of for these solo validators. And then the second goal is to prevent censorship by, again, sort of separating who is building the block from who is proposing the block. And currently sort of PBS is in its opt-in phase, so it's not integrated in protocol. However, there are plans to do so formally in the future. But what we did in this work sort of is that we first started by evaluating sort of the current state of PBS during this opt-in phase and sort of seeing if it aligns with its stated objective. So that is sort of decentralizing the block profits, giving everyone equal access to high value blocks, and censorship prevention. So first I'm going to start sort of just by going over the general trends. So the next slide, in some version you've probably seen this plot before, which is sort of that it shows sort of the share of blocks that are built through PBS and not PBS on Ethereum each day. And basically what you can see is that PBS is the primary way that blocks are being built on Ethereum. So by the end of our measurement period, which is almost a year ago at this point, sort of the figure set at 85%, and this basically stayed very high ever since. What we then also looked at is sort of like what share of these blocks are being built by each relay and builder. So now on the slide, you're sort of seeing an area plot for the share of blocks built by each of the biggest relays and sort of then the rest put together on a daily basis. And basically what we can observe is that especially initially this is an extremely centralized landscape. Sort of the flash plots relay for some time was responsible for more than half of the blocks in the network, which is quite a significant chunk, but sort of we see improvements towards the end. And then we did the same analysis sort of for the biggest builders as well. And here we also observed that there are quite a few builders, so maybe 3 of them, that are responsible for the majority of blocks. But what we do observe is that there is more diversity here than as for relays. And generally sort of this is also what we would expect, given sort of that the system places quite a bit of trust in the relays. So we would expect there to be few of them, but then sort of multiple builders, as it's not sort of as the proposers don't need to trust each builder individually, but just sort of the relay for making sure that everything is good with the blocks built by the relay. And then overall, sort of what we observed is that there's a general trend towards more decentralization for both builders and relays during our measurement period.
Can I ask a question actually?
Yeah.
On this graph. So I guess so like I'm kind of interested in that, the builder share, for example, of flashbots is almost constant, right? Like over time, whereas the its relay share is going down. Like I'm not sure exactly how to interpret that change in the relay share, but not in the builder share. Can you maybe explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think in part it's due to sort of the flashbots relays to also connecting to other builders, and these builders were maybe not ready right at the beginning, but then sort of were only joining the ecosystem later on. And as the flashbots relay sort of was still sort of getting these additional blocks from the additional builders, the relay share is quite significant, but the builder share stays relatively constant.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so then sort of the second thing we look at is sort of whether sort of PBS gives all the proposers access to these high value blocks as it promises to or as it wishes to. And for that, sort of what we first looked at is block value. So this is sort of any priority fees and any Coinbase transfers that are being paid by transactions in blocks. And on the plot on the slide now, basically, each of the dots represents a block. The red ones are non-PBS blocks and the blue ones are PBS blocks. And sort of then on the y-axis, you can see their value, and it's a log scale, just so that you're aware of it. And basically, what we can see is that it appears that PBS blocks, at least sort of on average, have a higher value than their non-PBS counterparts. And this is sort of as we would be expecting, because there are specialized builders that are sort of just specializing in building these high value blocks. But then sort of what we are more interested in is sort of to see what share of that, or actually the sort of proposer profit, because block value is sort of just the value of the block, but it does for the PBS blocks, this is not equal to the proposer profit. Instead, sort of the proposer profit is just the bid in the PBS auction, or so the share or the fraction of the block value that is being offered up by the builder to the proposer. And on the right slide, we're now sort of plotting the median proposer profit on a daily basis and comparing PBS and non-PBS. But also there we see sort of that PBS values, PBS blocks lead to a higher proposer profit. Especially so sort of on these high MEV days, which are, for instance, the FTX bankruptcy and the USD DPEG, which are sort of marked by the vertical lines in the plot. So in general, it appears really that PBS is giving proposers access to higher value blocks and all of them equally. So what we can conclude is that proposers are making greater profit if they use PBS as opposed to building their own blocks, at least on average. And we sort of give PBS then a check mark for achieving its first goal, which is to prevent sort of hobbyist validators from being outcompeted by institutional players. All data we sort of looked at, which there's also some additional ones to the things I showed in this presentation, basically suggested that sort of validators are getting equal access to high value blocks through PBS. And then the second goal, yes?
So are the validators that are not accessing the PBS infrastructure, are they like just choosing not to access it, or are they accessing it and then seeing that the non-PBS blocks are winning out sometimes?
I think it's a mixture. Okay. Sorry, did you have any?
No, just.
Okay, so no, I think it's a mixture of the two. I think there's some validators sort of that are choosing not to use PBS for whatever reason they're choosing to do so. And I think in other cases, sort of there might just not be any blocks that are being proposed with the PBS, and then sort of the clients automatically build their own vanilla blocks if they don't receive a block through the PBS, through PBS, at least in time. So I believe it's a mixture of the two, but it's a sort of, in the grand scheme, it's very few blocks that are non-PBS. Yes, and sort of then the other thing we looked at is the PBS roles in the censorship of transaction. And sort of the idea is how PBS was designed, or the idea was that it would prevent censorship because the proposers blindly sign the blocks, so large organizations cannot as easily pressure them to comply with sanctions. And basically the way we investigated this is that we sort of looked at whether sort of transactions are OFAC whether relays or blocks are OFAC compliant as a case study, so whether they comply with US sanctions. And for that, what is seen in the plot now is sort of, again, on a daily basis, the share of blocks proposed through PBS, which from relays which announce to be complying with OFAC. So they announce that they are censoring transactions on the OFAC list, and versus sort of the daily share of blocks proposed by relays that say that they don't comply with OFAC. So they are shown in blue, and these are the non-censoring relays, at least in regards to OFAC. And basically, sort of right after the merge, right when PBS launched, only 20% of blocks were actually being built by non-compliant, so non-censoring relays. And then this figure increased during our data collection to around 60%. So sort of during at least this period of time, the share of OFAC compliant relays, so censoring relays, were losing their market share. But also since then, some of the relays that at this time at least were OFAC non-compliant have now become OFAC compliant. So I'm not sure sort of how it continued. But what also is sort of interesting is that we also then looked at sort of the share of transactions which do not comply with OFAC sanctions in PBS blocks versus sort of non-PBS blocks. And there we sort of actually see that actually non-PBS blocks have a larger share of transactions that do not comply with OFAC sanctions than PBS blocks. So really sort of for PBS's second goal, there is a bit of a question mark as to whether it is able to achieve it, because sort of at least we do not find any evidence that it's much better at preventing censorship than sort of the previous system is, or the remaining blocks in the ecosystem are. And this sort of almost wraps up the first part. Maybe the last thing I want to touch up on a bit is sort of the trust in relays. So the current system really puts a lot of trust in the relays. Builders trust relays to keep their blocks blinded, and proposers trust relays to deliver the promised values and adhere to any sort of filtering promises that they make, such as being OFAC compliant. What we do find, though, in our analysis is that at least now and then, almost all of the relays do not fulfill at least some of their promises. So whether this is regarding the value, the block then actually doesn't have the full value that was promised, or whether this is sort of them not fully complying with their own filtering policies, so to have some holes in their filtering. Sort of, we find that there are these holes for basically all of the relays, but we do not have any sort of evidence to suggest that this is actually malicious behavior. But still, it sort of raises a question, because currently these relays, they have a lot of responsibility in the system. Validators have no choice but to place trust in them if they want to participate. But yet again, even though we're placing so much trust in these relays, they're not being compensated. So they are actually not receiving sort of any financial value, at least directly in the current design. And sort of this is, at least for now, this leaves us in the state where we're putting a lot of trust in these relays that we're not compensating. I think in the future, sort of, there are possible plans for native implementation of PBS, which generally remove the relays or at least reduce their responsibilities. But it's still a bit unclear if and when this will happen. Yes, so that then concludes sort of the first part of the presentation and brings me to the non-atomic arbitrage and DeFi part. So this is also commonly referred to as sex-dex arbitrage, and basically this is just arbitrage that results from price differences between on-chain markets, which for our purposes will always be Ethereum, and in all likelihood off-chain markets. It could also potentially be sort of on-chain markets on different blockchains, but largely we believe this to be off-chain markets, so centralized exchanges such as Binance, for instance. So in more detail, let's look at an example of this non-atomic arbitrage. So we have a centralized exchange and a decentralized exchange here, and they both have a Bitcoin USDC trading pair. So let's assume that initially the centralized exchange sort of quotes 39,000 for this trading pair, whereas the decentralized exchange does so as well. So we're in a period of time where prices are synchronized. So there's no arbitrage opportunity. However, what now happens, let's assume, is that the price moves to 40,000. And the centralized exchange in all likelihood will quickly reflect this new price. On the decentralized exchange, however, the price stays at this 39,000 as no block is processed in the meantime. So in between blocks, prices on decentralized exchanges cannot move. And sort of in Ethereum, at least approximately 12 seconds between blocks. And then as a result of this price difference, we now have an arbitrage opportunity for a searcher to grab at the beginning of the next block. So as the price of Bitcoin is higher on the centralized exchange than on the decentralized exchange, what a searcher would do to sort of take advantage of this arbitrage opportunity is sell Bitcoin for USDC on the centralized exchange and then buy Bitcoin for USDC on the decentralized exchange. Importantly, this is all called non-atomic arbitrage because there's no guarantee for sort of the second leg of this arbitrage opportunity to go through if the first leg had already executed. And now once this arbitrage opportunity is then taken advantage of, we would expect the prices of the venues to be more or less synchronized again. So in our example, they should both be roughly 40,000, but as a result of fees, it is actually not optimal to fully close the price difference, and also not every price difference results in a profitable arbitrage opportunity. But generally speaking, as one would expect, is that the bigger the price difference, the bigger the expected profit one can make from such an arbitrage opportunity. Okay. So non-atomic arbitrage is almost exclusively in our analysis is found in PBS blocks. So we look at the flow of a transaction has through the PBS ecosystem or the PBS design. So first, a price difference occurs. A searcher discovers this price difference between on and off-chain markets, and then the searcher creates a transaction to close this arbitrage opportunity on-chain. So here we're just looking at the on-chain leg of the non-atomic arbitrage. It then sends this transaction to one or potentially many builders. And importantly, here, what I'm now indicating by the colors of the different entities, the builder actually does not need to be a different entity than the searcher. But the searcher and the builder could actually be controlled by the same entity, what we will also see later on being the case. But generally, at least they're being designed to be different roles. Then the builder builds a block, which potentially includes the transaction, if the transaction has a high enough value to make it into the block. But generally, we would expect this to be the case since there's possibly a large profit to be made with this arbitrage opportunity. The block is then submitted to the relay, and if it's the highest value block for the current slot, passed on to the proposer. And then the block is picked by the proposer, and if it is proposed to the network, the arbitrage opportunity is closed. So this is roughly the flow of any non-atomic arbitrage transaction. Because they generally all go through the PBS scheme, especially since the PBS scheme also allows a builder to actually cancel a bid. So if the price difference were to be closed during the slot, then a builder could actually go ahead and cancel the bid and doesn't need to actually execute the on-chain leg of the non-atomic arbitrage. Mm-hmm. Also, Yes, so I think if I understand it correctly, it's sort of whether in the PBS scheme, whether sort of the value is being validated appropriately and the filtering policies. So the plot I was showing, this plot here, this is just sort of what it's self-reported by the relays. So the relays that claim to be OFAC compliant and the relays that do not claim to be OFAC compliant or that claim to be non-censoring. So this is self-reported data. But then what I was also getting at is that we then also analyzed. So we took sort of the OFAC list of addresses. And then we went through all Ethereum transactions and through their traces to see sort of whether their transaction at any point interacts with any of these sensor transactions. And then we also have a plot sort of in the paper that's not in the presentation that shows sort of the share of transactions which are sanctioned in both PBS and non-PBS blocks. And there actually we found that PBS blocks had a lower share of the sanctioned transactions than non-PBS blocks. Perfect, thank you. Yes. So I guess then jumping back to the non-atomic arbitrage part. So non-atomic arbitrage is a type of MEV transaction, so minor maximal extractable value, just some sort of high value transaction that can be made by whoever is building the block or proposing the block. However, sort of the challenge with non-atomic arbitrage, at least with measuring, is that it's a bit more difficult and especially less clear-cut to identify sort of than other types of MEV, such as sandwich attack, cyclic arbitrage, or liquidations, which have previously been extensively studied. For these sort of all actions we're seeing are on-chain. So we have quite a complete picture of what is going on. But for non-atomic arbitrage, the challenge is sort of that while we're observing sort of this on-chain transaction on Ethereum, we have little to no visibility into the off-chain transactions. But what we found is that sort of regardless of this challenge, we're still able to infer, at least with some sort of high probability, whether a transaction is non-atomic arbitrage or not. And basically, we designed a set of heuristics, and we designed those guided by sort of one main assumption, which is that non-atomic arbitrage transactions have a high value. So searchers that are performing these non-atomic arbitrages are likely to protect their transactions, for instance, submit them privately, and pay suspicious amounts to have their seemingly simple swap included. Because sort of what we're seeing on-chain is just like one swap on a decentralized exchange, no complicated sort of things that are being executed. And then what we did sort of guided by these assumptions is we designed a set of heuristics which allowed us to identify non-atomic arbitrage, and we then also sort of performed some sanity checks on the heuristics. But I'm not going to go into it in too much or in any detail due to sort of time reasons. But what we then did is we sort of identified non-atomic arbitrage, and then by looking at the 5 biggest decentralized exchanges on the Ethereum blockchain, and basically our main analysis is then sort of what I'm going to talk about, divided into 4 sections. So we look at the overall landscape, look at some of the drivers of non-atomic arbitrage, study this vertical integration of searchers and builders, so them being the same entity is what I hinted at previously. And then finally, we also looked at sort of the impact of non-atomic arbitrage on the Ethereum ecosystem and PBS. So let's just start with the general landscape. And what I'm showing on the slide now is the cumulative volume of non-atomic arbitrage swaps. And this is sort of by searcher. So here we're seeing the top 11 searchers separately and then sort of the rest grouped together. And basically the first thing I want to note is that in total, this non-atomic arbitrage during our data collection period, which is from the merge until I believe the end of October, is 132 billion US dollars. So this is a staggering amount. And this actually accounts for more than 1/4 of the decentralized exchange volume on these 5 exchanges that we were investigating. Then what we also observed that there are sort of two periods of time which exhibit significant increases in this cumulative volume. So one is mid-November 2022, that is the FTX collapse. And basically that came with a lot of cryptocurrency price volatility. And then the other one is mid-March 2023, which is sort of a period of time that is sort of related to the USDC DPEG and also came with high cryptocurrency price volatility. And basically during these high cryptocurrency price volatility periods, we were seeing dramatic increases in non-atomic arbitrage volume, which is also what we would be expected because it sort of results from price differences between on and off-chain markets. And these are expected to be higher during times of high volatility. And then what I also want to see note on or touch upon is sort of that again we have a quite centralized landscape. The top 11 searchers are actually responsible for 80% of non-atomic arbitrage volume. And even more impressively, sort of a mere 2 searchers are responsible for nearly 50% of the total volume during our collection period. So this really goes to show that, again, we have a quite centralized landscape at our hands where a few players seem to be very good at performing these arbitrage transactions. And then sort of the next thing that we looked at is the drivers of non-atomic arbitrage. And what I'm showing on the plot now is sort of the daily volume of non-atomic arbitrage trades. And again, sort of we see peaks during the FTX collapse and the USDC DPEG. And as one, at least theoretically, price volatility should be a driver of non-atomic arbitrage. So what we did is that we also looked at the daily ETH price volatility, which is now shown on the slide as well. And we sort of look at the correlation between the two. And we find that there's a very high and also extremely significant correlation of 0.725. And then we also repeat sort of the same analysis for Bitcoin. And again, sort of find that there's a high correlation between the Bitcoin price volatility and the daily non-atomic arbitrage volume. So really, even though a correlation does not indicate a causation, it appears that this non-atomic arbitrage volume, as one would expect, is driven by the price volatility.
Can I ask one question on this?
Yeah.
So it seems like this price volatility of these outside chains is like the main driver of this, not like somebody doing some large trades on chain on a DEX and like leaving some arbitrage opportunity in that block.
Yes, we didn't look at this into too much detail, but like sort of through like this correlation analysis, this does suggest, and some other things we also did, but it appears that it's sort of these outside price changes that are moving it, or that are responsible for this or creating these non-atomic arbitrage opportunities. But I've actually seen one example sort of that goes into the different direction. So like someone leaving arbitrage, someone doing a big trade on the blockchain, and by that sort of moving the prices between the two, which was the result of a large liquidation. So sort of a large liquidation was happening on chain. Through that, the prices on the decentralized exchanges actually moved significantly, and that was then later on reflected on the centralized exchanges. But this is sort of the only example I know of that goes into the other direction, but there are probably also some others.
Makes sense.
Okay, and sort of then at least one thing we also wanted to look at is sort of this vertical integration, and that is searchers basically being the same entity as the builder. And there was previous work which sort of identified 3 so-called HFT builders, Beaver Builder, Async Builder, and Manta Builder, and said sort of that they are likely to be operating their own non-atomic arbitrage searchers, so searchers that are specializing on it. However, sort of there was no real link established, and what we then did is sort of we wanted to see whether we could empirically establish links between sort of these searchers and these HFT builders, as they're referred to. And on the figure now on the slide, we're basically showing the proportion of this non-atomic arbitrage volume by each of the biggest 11 searchers included in blocks built by the biggest 9 builders. So we have on the x-axis the builders and on the y-axis the searchers. And the darker the tone of blue of one of these squares, the larger sort of the proportion of this non-atomic arbitrage volume by the searcher in blocks of the corresponding builder. And what we can see, for instance, is that roughly 80% of non-atomic arbitrage volume from Beaver Searcher 1 and Beaver Searcher 2 are in blocks of Beaver build. So we conclude sort of that these searchers are likely associated with the builder and that they are being controlled by the builder. And then similarly for builder 1, 83% of the non-atomic arbitrage volume by builder searcher 1 is located in blocks by builder 1. So again, we assume them to be the same entity. And the same also goes for Manta searcher and Manta builder, where 83% of the volume of the searcher is in blocks by the builder. The one that is a bit more interesting than the others is actually rsync builder. So for rsync builder, we have that 88% of volume from rsync searcher 2 and 98% of volume from rsync searcher 3 are in blocks by the builder. But we do not sort of see the same link for rsync searcher 1 and rsync builder. But here sort of we're still able to establish a link because the searcher 1 and the searcher 2 actually had an identical bytecode of their contracts. So one can assume them to be the same entity. But sort of this first searcher was actually operating before the builder ever became active. Okay. So this is sort of to go to show that these integrated searchers that are likely being controlled by the builders themselves really have all or a very large proportion of their volume in the blocks by the builders. But what we also find is sort of a bit of the opposite, which is that the non-integrated searchers, so for instance, Jump Searcher as an example, appear to be having a harder time of having their non-atomic arbitrage traits included in blocks by these HFT builders. So for instance, Jump Searcher generally has its volume in blocks by flashbots, for instance, and not in blocks by these 4 HFT builders. And it really seems to be that either sort of these other searchers are less likely to submit their transactions to these HFT builders, or that these 4 HFT builders are really favoring their own integrated searchers. And that brings me sort of then to the final part of our analysis, which is what is the impact of this non-atomic arbitrage on the entire ecosystem. And so on the slide, basically, what I'm showing is the share of non-atomic arbitrage volume in these HFT builder blocks. And basically, what you can see is that from 2023 onwards, this figure is generally higher than 50%, oftentimes around 75%. So really a lot of the non-atomic arbitrage volume is found in these HFT builder blocks. And what is also important to maybe reiterate on again is that there are only 4 of these builders, and only 2 of them are really at any time active at the same time. So there's an incredibly small number of these HFT builders that have a huge grasp on the non-atomic arbitrage market. And then what we also sort of look. Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to the wrong direction. Yeah. Oh, the rsync searcher 1 and the rsync searcher 2? They're just for rsync searcher 1 and rsync searcher 2, they're just different smart contracts. But yeah, they have exactly the same bytecode. They just, like for rsync searcher in particular, the 3 searchers, I mean, the third one has a different code, but they were just operating at distinct periods in time. So there's no period in time when 2 of them are operating at the same time. So they just somehow seem to be replacing, their searchers with new smart contracts. Okay, so then sort of this brings me to the final sort of analysis we did, or that I'm going to present, which is sort of the daily share of blocks won by these HFT builders. So this is sort of the daily share of blocks for which these HFT builders won the PBS auction. And at any point in time, really only 2 of them are active. And basically sort of this is a figure that is increasing. So from the merge until the end of October 2023. And so it's a figure that is increasing over time. So really these HFT builders seem to be picking up somehow. And what we then also do is, if we look again at the Ethereum and Bitcoin price volatility, what we find is sort of that there is a correlation between the share of blocks that are won by these HFT builders and this price volatility. So the figures that I'm showing on the slide are for the month of October 2023. And basically what this brings us to conclude is that if we have these periods of high price volatility, these HFT builders are more likely to win the PBS auction. So what that really sort of goes to show is that this non-atomic arbitrage is a centralizing force in the block construction market, especially as there are so few of these HFT builders. So at the end of October 2023, there were only 2 that were active. And sort of this then, brings me sort of to the wrap up of the non-atomic arbitrage part. And sort of one of the first findings is that we can actually identify non-atomic arbitrage and quantify its scale. And really it has, it's remarkable sort of how big the scale of this non-atomic arbitrage is. So what we saw is that it accounts for more than 1/4 of decentralized exchange volume, and actually also more than 10% of Ethereum block value during this period of time. And then what we also see, and I think this is sort of a common theme, is that we have a quite centralized landscape at our hands. But even more so than we're seeing sort of with other things such as the PBS analysis we did previously. So we find sort of that there are just 2 searchers that are responsible for half the volume, and that these HFT builders really have an advantage during times of this high price volatility. So if we have high price volatility, it's very likely that an HFT builder will win the PBS auction. So this non-atomic arbitrage really is sort of a centralizing force for the block construction market and also sort of the PBS auction by extension. Okay, so this sort of brings me to the end of the presentation, and I'm happy to answer any other questions.
I have another question. So I guess you mentioned in the beginning, like the non-atomic part of the arbitrage is like kind of saying you're not guaranteed to like complete your arbitrage opportunity because you have like include your arbitrage in the next block. So is that kind of like why it's so centralized, because it's like not a guaranteed profit?
I think that could be a driving force in it. What I believe and what I've been hearing when talking to people is sort of that actually what happens is sort of these builders, they wait, these searchers, or whoever is performing this non-atomic arbitrage, they wait to see whether their transaction is included, and only then do they include sort of the off-chain, do they perform the off-chain leg of the arbitrage. So in that sense, they have a bit of certainty. Like at that point, they know that their transaction is very likely on chain unless it's sort of forked out and in the aftermath. But I think sort of one reason it's so centralized, in addition to that it's just more complicated to some extent because there are more uncertainties. It's also that, it seems to be it seems to be that sort of these traditional high frequency trading firms are just very good at doing it. I mean, they also need access to the centralized or to the off-chain markets. And a few of the searchers or builders sort of have been associated with sort of large HFT firms, or at least rumored to be associated with them.
Yeah, that makes sense. But it still seems like there's kind of a risk, like, even if your thing is on chain, like I guess the off chain price can change.
Yes, no,
in
it's
that
certainly
scenario.
that. You're absolutely right. I mean, there is this risk there, and I think this makes it, as you sort of hint at, harder for for sort of anyone to take advantage of this. And I guess if you're doing these huge volumes, then you can sort of cancel out the risk. Like you don't need every transaction to work. You just need the majority of them to give you a profit.
Okay, so that was a great talk. Thank you. I think I'm going to end the stream now, unless there are any other questions that I see on YouTube. Okay, we have one more question from Socrates 1024. What do you think the protocol can do to address the centralization associated with HFT searchers?
That's very interesting. Sort of, there are two things that we sort of touch upon a bit, but they're both not perfect solutions. So one was proposed previously, which is sort of to separate the top of block arbitrage opportunities from the remaining. So that by top of block, they just mean that generally these non-atomic arbitrage trades, they're at the beginning of the block because they want to be the ones that are closing the price, and to sort of have separate auctions for this top of block and the remaining block. However, sort of, we believe that there are quite a few challenges with this. So you somehow need to say what size of the block is the top of block and what size of the block is the rest of the block. And depending sort of on how volatile prices are at the moment, this will be vastly different. So I believe it's very difficult to sort of say how much each is supposed to be. And if it's sort of not done, then in the end, it probably will all overlap. So if there's not enough space in the top of block, then these non-atomic arbitrage trades will also sort of move into the remaining block, and we will have somewhat the same thing again. And the other thing is also there that with this approach, what you're not getting at or what you're not solving is the additional security risks. So as typical sort of with MEV or high value blocks in general, there are incentives for the next proposer to fork the previous block out and take the value themselves. And this sort of is not being targeted at all with this proposal. And then the second thing is that sort of the larger the time between blocks, the larger this non-atomic arbitrage is supposed to be, because sort of volatility increases with time. So if we had shorter block times, one would expect that this sort of phenomenon is heavily reduced. However, of course, if we just go ahead and shorten Ethereum block times, there are probably a bunch more consequences which are negative for the ecosystem. But sort of one thing which could be done quite easily and which should target it a bit is sort of if we just move the decentralized exchange liquidity to sort of the layer 2s, such as Arbitrum and Optimism, which already have much shorter block times, and therefore we wouldn't expect these price differences to be occurring as frequently. It will probably all still happen and is in all likelihood also happening on the layer 2s, but at a smaller scale.
So here's a follow-up question. What effect would Pepsi or single slot finality have?
I'm actually not sure, but sort of happy to discuss it at any other time. But right now, I don't have sort of a good answer for it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, interesting answers. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Okay. So with that, I think I'm going to end the stream. Thanks everyone on YouTube for joining, and ending stream now. All right, cool. That's that. And thanks.